Chapter 40, La M is spreading like a cancer. California State Prison at Lancaster, CSP, wasn't a daycare center. It was still a level 4 institution filled with murderers, attempted murderers, kidnappers, carjackers, rapists, robbers, burglars, and pumped up, shave-headed, tattooed gangsters who would make a suburban housewife's heart stop if she saw one walking toward her on the street. At the same time, it was no Pelican Bay shoe. Renee could spend his days standing on grass, smoking cigarettes in one of the 3 big prison yards and look up at blue, cloud-free skies and feel the Southern California sun bathe his skin. In a large open space where an inmate could walk freely inside the cell block, prisoners played backgammon, chess, checkers, or cards at little tables. There were roll calls 2 times a day so that guards could account for all inmates. But to a man who had spent more than a decade in relative solitary confinement, Lancaster was freedom. Plus, there was no mafia politics swiveling his brain. He had a job working on the grounds crew, and at first he enjoyed the change from his more dungeness-like existence at Pelican Bay. However, there were immediate drawbacks. The cell block where he lived and the yard he walked was a protective custody (PC) facility filled with inmates he had always disdained. Gang dropouts, snitches, and sex offenders. It was horrible, Renee said. There were other adjustments to make as well. The years of solitary confinement had made him jumpy around crowds. I didn't like to be surprised, so I stayed away from the bustling chow hall, preferring to eat in my cell. Some inmates still thought he was a sleeper for the mob, there only to kill mafia enemies on the sensitive needs yard. They were wary of his presence. There were guards too who had nothing but skepticism about scorn for this former MA hitman turned PC inmate. Who could blame them? Ironically, he found the correctional officers at Pelican Bay to be the best in their treatment of inmates. One old family friend recalled her first visit to see Renee at his new Lancaster digs. He was nervous and his hands were sweating. He'd never been among families and visitors on visiting days. If he heard a fast movement, he jumped. There were stark reminders of why he left the mob life. A couple of Mexican mafia associates on the yard walked up to Renee and said, "Hey, I killed a guy for you," Renee recalled. I had no idea who they were, what I'd asked them to do or why. It showed how empty the whole MA process is and how everyone is used. Yet the boxer part of Renee still had an ego that could fill Dodger Stadium. People still feared him, and he wasn't totally ashamed of his former reputation. In fact, he still relished the attention it accorded him, even on a PC yard. Freddie Veneno Gonzalez, another mafia dropout at Lancaster, told him, "You're just a regular Joe now. Get used to it." He couldn't. Within weeks of his arrival at Lancaster, Renee felt abandoned. People who were supposed to change my life didn't change my life. They just extracted information and dumped me. He became depressed. Renee had been clean and sober for more than 4 years. His sobriety came during a realization at Pelican Bay that he was nothing more than a jailhouse junkie. He wanted to show my sons and parents that even in prison, I could be more than a washed out heroin addict. That was no small accomplishment, considering that only about 3% of heroin addicts ever give it up for good. Suddenly at Lancaster, however, the allure of drugs was as strong as a naked woman lying on his bunk. A number of inmates kept asking Renee if he got high. Then a prisoner named Aaron Jeffro of Gardena said, "I'll give you a gram of heroin to get on your feet." Renee and his new cellie, a Norteño from Sacramento named Louis, slammed. He felt home again as the opiate flowed through his blood, caressed his brain, and massaged his ego. Heroin seemed like an old friend, but much like La M, it always stabbed him in the back. "I wanted to start getting money and dope again," said Renee. He looked around the yard and saw old tatty gangsters who acted tough but weren't real mobsters. Renee felt that they were mentally weak. "I'm going to have some position somewhere," he rationalized. "I just can't stand being a no account." He started hustling dope on the yard, smuggling methamphetamine into the prison every week through a girlfriend visitor, and stayed as high as he could. He was gagged on dope as he headed across the yard and ran into Johnny Duran, a former MS associate from San Diego who had found Christianity behind bars. Johnny introduced himself to Renee. "Jesus loves you," assured Duran. "When you're ready, we'll be here." Renee shook his hand and didn't give the encounter a second thought. He was forcing himself to get out of bed every day. Thought about whacking someone to grab another case in the transfer, and downed himself in every intoxicating substance he could get his hands on. I drank until I blacked out and was shooting dope until I couldn't see. I didn't care anymore. His son Bobby, who had just graduated from UCLA, came to visit his father and could see he was on a downward spiral. "What's the matter, Dad?" Renee could see the disappointment on his son's face. "Look what you're doing to yourself. Please stop using," Bobby pleaded. "I don't want to see you like this." Locked up in prison for nearly all Bobby's life, Boxer hadn't been much of a father. In truth, the young man was saved by his grandfather, who tried to make up for the mistakes he made with his own sons. Bobby was the first college graduate in the family. Renee was bursting with pride and hope for him. His drug-weary eyes filled with tears and he cried. Desperate to get a hold of himself, Renee later wrote a letter to a former high-level SSU contact who had moved on to another job. Agent Dan Evania was sent to see him instead. He was an earnest, clean-cut, no-nonsense guy with grown kids, all championship swimmers who went to college with the help of scholarships. Discipline seemed to be an Evania family virtue. The old Boxer alter ego had just finished slamming some Oxycontin and meth when a guard popped his door and said there was someone waiting to talk to him. Renee looked down and saw his shirt was dripping wet from the rush of drugs. I put on sunglasses, grabbed a baseball cap, and pulled it down low on my head, as if to hide his deteriorating physical condition. Evania, wearing a green jacket, was sitting next to a gang investigator, Steve Preciado, and his lieutenant when Renee was escorted into the room. "What's happening, Holmes?" Evania said in greeting as he reached out his long arm to shake hands. It amused Renee how Evania always talked to him in street language. The man couldn't look or act more like a cop, but Renee respected him as one of the good guys. "Take off your sunglasses," ordered the tall lawman. Renee slowly peeled the lenses from his face. "You're on drugs," said Evania. "It wasn't a question." "No," lied the beaten mafia dropout. "You're fucking up, Renee. I ain't using." The lie came just as easy the second time, but he knew no one was buying it. Preciado and his lieutenant were chuckling in disgust. They'd been recording his phone calls and knew all about the small drug smuggling operation he had been running for weeks. Renee was busted. Visits were cut off for 3 years, and he was taken to administrative segregation to serve out more punishment. He knew he was done with SSU. Evania could only deliver a negative report. During 9 months in the hole, Renee never abandoned his drug habit. It was a cycle of doom. I hustled and sold everything I had to buy heroin or meth. If he couldn't get his drugs of choice, he used codeine or wine to take off the edge. It was more the same when he returned to the PC yard. One day he looked around his house, his cell, and there was nothing. I'd hawked everything I owned for drugs. Renee made an appointment to speak with Dave Foote, the lieutenant on his yard. "Get me off the dope block and put me on the Christian block," he pleaded. Shortly afterward, Renee walked into the block that housed many of the protective custody inmates who were born-again Christians. "You remember me?" someone asked. "I'm the guy who told you Jesus loved you." It was Johnny Duran from San Diego, a year and a half after Enriquez had run into him on the yard. "Yes," Renee said. "He needed a safe haven." He was clean for 2 weeks, slipped once using some heroin, and then stayed clean for a month. In December 2005, some new visitors came to see him, and they offered him another chance to change his life. 3 LA County Sheriff's deputies working on the task force were waiting to see him. They had a flowchart outlining the drug operation of Mexican Mafia member Daryl Baca. One of them was a soft-spoken young deputy with a friendly manner named Jeff Bosket, the son of a homicide detective. He asked, "Can I help you with this?" Renee didn't waste any time waiting to answer. "Yes," he offered. He didn't want to jack these cops around. Maybe they were his salvation. FBI agent Glenn Hadama, who talked with Renee 2 years earlier, had completely overlooked his value. He had been the one to recommend that these task force deputies make a trip to Lancaster. Bosket told Renee, "Okay, we'll be back." "No," he pleaded, "get a court order and take me now." Bosket, for the next few years, would become Renee's trusted custodian, chief cop, counselor, and caregiver, all rolled into one. On December 22nd, 2005, Detective Jeff Bosket, carrying a stun gun and a 9mm Beretta, and Detective Joe Villanueva armed with a 9mm Beretta of his own, escorted Rene to an undercover car and drove the Mexican Mafia dropout to the LA County Sheriff's substation in Lancaster. There, the ex-mafioso and the two deputies boarded a Drug Enforcement Administration DEA helicopter for a short flight to another jail facility east of downtown Los Angeles. He moved for months, one satellite lockup to another, partly for his own safety. In February 2006, Rene received one of those phone calls he feared in his dreams. His father had a stroke. I lost my composure and was sobbing on the phone. My pop is dying. I don't want my pop to die. His father didn't die, but was left with impaired speech. It was difficult to understand his words. After the stroke, the first time I talked to him, it wasn't my dad. He wasn't the same man. It was sad. It had taken years to quell the anger and open up communications with his father, and now it was nearly impossible to have a conversation with him. It was not only sad, but a bitter irony as well. Then on August 8, 2006, while Rene was housed temporarily at the San Bernardino County Jail, Bosquet got a tip about an execution plot. According to the detective, another MA member, who was housed in the same facility on a different tier, used a jail trustee to deliver a message to a Sureño inmate celled next to Rene Enriquez. The message ordered the prisoner to kill Boxer. There was no doubt the Mafia still wanted him dead. Meanwhile, Rene continued to work with local and federal law enforcement on a myriad of Mexican Mafia cases. They involved multiple murders, in and out of prison walls, drug trafficking, and extortion. He acted as an invaluable resource, providing detailed knowledge of the inner workings of La M and his cast of players. Rene Enriquez, in effect, became something of a Mafia consultant, working on task force projects with names such as Operation Anaconda, Operation Knockout, and Operation in the Hat. He has made a series of training videos for local, state, and federal law enforcement groups. Still, his reputation as a hardened Mafia hitman followed him and put him in the middle of a murder-for-hire plot. While housed at another suburban Los Angeles area jail in 2004, Rene was celled up with a convicted Cuban-born drug dealer named George Martinez, who headed up a narcotics trafficking operation that smuggled multi-kilo loads of cocaine from Mexico into the United States and Canada. The 37-year-old Martinez had lived in a $2.5 million house in Downey and owned restaurants, apartment buildings, and a fleet of expensive automobiles that included an armored Mercedes-Benz and a Ferrari Spider. Wiretaps by Federal Drug Task Force caught Martinez saying that he had made at least $8 million in drug profits before he was arrested in 2004. Rene said Martinez believed his wife was stealing all his hidden money, was beating their children, and was having sex with his attorney while he was wasting away in jail. The extravagant woman had $250,000 of Louis Vuitton luggage. Martinez hired Rene to kill her for $100,000. He wrote out instructions telling me how it should be done. He wanted her shot, not in front of their children, and requested that the body be dumped in Mexico with a note pinned to her chest reading, "Sigue hablando, soplón." Keep on talking, rat. I know my Spanish ain't good, man. You motherfuckers know what I'm talking about. Rene snatched the note for proof and on several occasions wore a wire taped to his skin under a loose Calvin Klein sweater or hidden inside a pair of Billabong shorts. It was all under the tutelage of Bosquet and other task force officers. Rene found it nerve-wracking, but the officers convinced me I was saving the woman's life. George Martinez, already looking at decades behind bars, is facing a new trial and a lot more prison time.